Welcome to Torah Smash, the podcast for nerdy Jews, where our lives of Jewish learning collide with our love of nerd culture. In each episode, we discuss what we lovingly call a Torah Smash, which we have defined as a beautiful collision of one thing from the world of Judaism with another from nerd culture. I am RDY, and joining me today are
Barak Malkin,
Ethan Lane Miller,
Rabbi Alan Cook.
Woohoo! Yay! Welcome.
Our
Thank
guest
you.
for today's episode is my friend and colleague, Rabbi Alan Cook. Rabbi Cook is a rabbi at Sinai Temple in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, where he has served since 2013. Alan grew up in a Reform rabbinic household steeped in Jewish culture and tradition. In fact, his father was one of my predecessors at a previous congregation. Alan also grew up heavily obsessed with popular culture, and at one point in the mid-'80s could tell you all your primetime viewing options every night for the big three networks for Jason and Susan's younger children. Three networks was all we had as children. Without needing to consult a TV guide. Also, a TV guide was a paper magazine that came to your home and told you what was on television each night.
RDY, what's a magazine?
A magazine is a collection of paper, usually thinner than regular paper, that are stapled together to give you stories written under a certain publisher, similar to a comic book.
Thank you. I think I'm understanding now.
Back to Rabbi Cook. Rabbi Cook believes that the 1979 original Muppet movie is the greatest work of cinematic genius ever committed to film, and that anyone suggesting otherwise is just perpetuating a myth. He is married. Yes. He is married to Rabbi Jody Cook, and they have three children, ages 18, 15, and 8. All of them begrudgingly tolerate Alan's nerdy obsessions. Not mentioned in his bio that I happen to know about him is that he, among other many, many nerddoms, is a master of punning, and I'm hoping that he will, or has already, created the pun for the end of the episode this week. See or challenge submitted, sir. Welcome,
Right.
Rabbi Alan Cook.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Definite bucket list item now
What?
can be crossed off.
We're on somebody's bucket list. That's crazy.
We have finally made it.
We've made it.
Oh,
This is the
wow.
big time. I will say you're in good company. I think my family also begrudgingly tolerates my nerdy obsessions, but it's hard to, my wife allowed me to decorate my office however I wanted, but the rest of the house needs her input. And so I think that falls under begrudgingly tolerates.
My collection of Cookie Monster paraphernalia and figurines is also confined to my office and is not allowed to come home.
I similarly have a collection that is confined to my office.
It's super funny.
I'm not contributing to this conversation, just to be clear.
I was waiting for that.
So, Alan, why don't you take us in for today's episode?
Thank you. So in February of 1983, we tuned in to a two-part episode of Different Strokes that sure still had a few laughs here and there, but was a little bit more serious than most episodes featuring Arnold Jackson's antics, and it was called The Bicycle Man. And Arnold and his friend Dudley found themselves in a very uncomfortable situation where the bicycle salesman that they had visited ended up being a pedophile. And without getting into too graphic detail, there was some real jeopardy and some real serious issues. And the end of the episode concluded with Conrad Bain, who played Philip Drummond, coming on and talking about how if you were yourself actually in a situation where you thought that you were in danger, here were the proper authorities to contact. This kicked off what is known as very special episodes. I don't know that there's been a lot of scholarly work done about this, but most authorities, at least on the internet, which we know is very authoritative, seem to agree that this episode was the starting episode. Certainly you had the sitcoms of Norman Lear, All in the Family, and Maude, and so forth. that delved into more serious issues, but those tended to be the entire scope of the series, whereas Different Strokes had a one-off here or there. Other well-known ones included when Matthew Perry played Carol's boyfriend on Growing Pains and died in a drunk driving accident. There were a number of these other issues, and I'm so excited. I'm so scared to talk about very special episodes with you today.
Wow. I remember watching this episode as a kid. You and I are around the same age. And I remember my mother, specifically, my parents generally saying, we are watching this as a family. I guess she had read something about it, and I remember so much about that episode. Like, he plied them with alcohol.
Exactly.
And he made Dudley like take his shirt off. And I would say predator more than just pedophile.
Definitely. And, I wonder, because I do have a recollection of watching the episode myself, but I wonder, in the pre-internet age, in the even CNN age, where news didn't come to us quite as readily, for the benefit of Susan, as it did today, I wonder how your parents knew that this was something to, not just plunk you in front of the TV and show you. I wonder how any parents knew. I know that there were advisories that came on before the program saying viewer discretion advised, but I don't know how much, I believe Different Strokes was on NBC. I don't know how much NBC really advertised and telegraphed this, extensively beforehand.
Well, this is something I was going to talk about, is that there was a shift sometime in the mid 2000s, I want to say, where prior to that, even Buffy and Smallville also had episodes that talked about serious topics, but those warnings mostly came at the end with either usually one of the characters talking to the camera as a person, as their own individual. And nowadays, there's a pre-warning, because prior to that, writers are like, no, let's shock and awe. Let's really get at their heartstrings, whatever it is. And nowadays they're like, that's so traumatic for some people to leave that in and not give them the heads up. So nowadays, when there's these special episodes, there'll be a pre-warning, just like we've had on some of our episodes, that states, this episode will show instances of yada, 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 right? I'm listening to the Smallville rewatch podcast, Talkville, and they just talked about an episode where Clark Kent falls in love with another woman with powers, and they have sexual relations in the episode. And the end of the episode, they have somebody talking to the camera about, practicing safe sex. And that was at the end. They didn't do any sort of preeminent warning of situations, even for something in that sort of tone. But I'm trying to think if there was a recent show I was watching where, This Is Us, not as nerdy, but still, This Is Us episodes where they have those strong, powerful ones. At the beginning, there'll be a warning for it. And at the end, they'll have the informational thing at the end. Right? Netflix whole system has this episode includes violence and strong language and alcohol and whatever.
One of the shows that I watch on Dropout TV is watching people play Dungeons and Dragons. It's my version of sports. And
it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Don't defend it.
They, before every episode, they're like, here's a list of the things that happen in this episode. And when I click on the link that gives you all the things that happen in that episode, I'm like, this is Dungeons and Dragons. If these things bother you, you really should watch another show.
Right. Well, Barak, you mentioned the 2000s. I didn't do my research adequately because I don't know exactly when this happened, but the TV rating system, we didn't have that on sitcoms and so forth when we grew up. But sometime I would also venture to guess it was in the 2000s, there was this, TVG, TVPG, and the little initials that come on the screen for, this has violence, this has sexual content, this has language. You have that forewarning, even if it's not, as you said, the actors coming out and giving you that warning. But at any rate, you have this prevalence peaking in, I would say, the 80s and 90s of these very special episodes. And the tide sort of turns actually with the advent of Seinfeld and Larry David saying, no, this is going to be the show about nothing. And this is going to be something that doesn't have neat morality plays, and the characters don't learn a lesson at the end, and you don't have very special episodes and so forth.
So I actually was sitting here thinking, knowing that I am of a slightly different generation, growing up in the 90s. I remember when ratings first started coming out on TV shows. I was 7.
Okay.
So it happened in 1997. And so I remember that became a thing on TV shows I'd watch, be like, oh, what does this mean? And I mean, it's all taken off from there. But yes, I remember remembering it, if that makes sense. Like, I remember that I noticed, like, oh, this is new.
I'm so intrigued, Alan, where the Smash is in this.
Yeah, where are we going with that?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what is Jewish about very special episodes? Where in Judaism do we find something akin to very special episodes?
Well, my first reaction is, what makes very special episodes special is it's hitting on something, I would say, morality based, which I hope is something that's important to Jews and Judaism. And one would argue that the stories in the Torah are about morality, or we can glean lessons on morality from them.
I'm trying to think. This is not the Smash at all. The only thing that comes to mind is the blessings before and after reading the Torah of like, hey, just a heads up, you're going to read this book. There's a lot of violence and sex and alcohol and et cetera, et cetera. Maybe you'll get a good one, but just a heads up, you're about to read this book. And then at the end, hey, you've read this book. We've just acknowledged we've read the book.
That's an interesting thought, except yes, the blessings, textually are merely an acknowledgement of having read them. They don't contain any of that content warning.
And there's no warning about, as the podcast is being recorded, what we're about to read in the Torah, and as the podcast is being listened to, what we read a couple weeks ago, Tazria and Matzorah, which this year happened to be 2 separate weeks, where there's a lot of gory and gross and not really applicable to modern day science and medicine and culture, but a lot of stuff that sometimes makes people go like, well, I'm not really interested in this. But that's not the same thing.
Right.
A warning.
I wouldn't get too focused on the warning idea of it as much as I would in the content and the framework of how very special episodes play out. So the other example that I gave, or that I sort of obliquely gave in saying, I'm so excited, I'm so excited, I'm so scared, that's a reference to an episode of Saved by the Bell where Jesse is confronted by Zach, who finds out that she's been taking caffeine pills to try to be successful on her exams. So we have issues like drug abuse. We have issues like pedophilia and sexual predators. We have all of these issues that are sort of coming at you out of left field from a sitcom that was otherwise just a family sitcom. You expected Different Strokes, for instance, because of its premise, to talk to you about race. You expected Saved by the Bell because of its premise in high school to talk about angsty teens, but you didn't necessarily expect them to delve into these particular topics.
Okay, I don't think this is right, but I'll give you an Ethan answer.
Okay.
To me, this is the reality of working with kids. You've got your plan, you've got what regularly happens, and one of them asks a question or says something, and suddenly your whole plan for that day is completely changed. I remember I was teaching Judaics. It was like 3rd or 4th grade. And we're talking about David and Goliath. And we're like halfway through the lesson, one of the kids goes, did this really happen? And I closed my book and I sat down and I was like, well, this is not quite what I thought we were going to do today, but let's talk about it. That was a very special episode of religious school.
That's a fabulous angle to it. It's not exactly what I was thinking of, but I think that does happen. And those are sometimes the most beautiful moments. I had a meeting this morning to help plan Limudim, the educational lessons for the 2 weeks that I'm going to be on faculty at Olin Seng Ruby Union Institute.
Shout out to Azrui.
Yes, and we were talking about, all these lessons and planning them down almost, to the last minute. But I'm working with Sophiem campers entering 3rd through 7th grade. We know that not everything that we put on that paper will happen, and yes, that's the nature of the beast. So it's fabulous, but it's not where I'm going.
I'm thinking about a particular episode in the Torah where it's going one way, and then at the very end, it takes a hard turn. And that's the story of Noah, where at the end of the story of Noah, of course, the ark lands on dry land, and the first thing Noah does is plant a vineyard, and then he gets stupid drunk. And his children have to deal with their drunken father, one of whom reacts badly and two of whom protect his dignity and take care of him.
RGY is getting closer, but I'm curious to hear what Brock has.
All right, I'll give you mine that's wrong. Another wrong answer. Then we'll have you lead us in to the teachings. Is that it would be very meta of you as a rabbi to come on and do this, but my guess would be sermons would be the very special episode parts of these where you do the reading of the Torah, you explain what it is, and then the rabbi comes forward, or the B mitzvah student of that week comes out and then gives their interpretation or talks more about this special thing that happened and explains why it's so important and why you have to pay attention to this part of the portion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it to a certain degree. I will stop keeping you all in suspense and reveal what I was thinking of, which is that, as I know you all have talked about previously on the podcast, Torah uses an economy of words and an economy of characters. And so there are many people who are seemingly central to the narrative, but are never fully fleshed out. And then we have some who are introduced to us in great detail, but they pop up only for their particular little story, but they don't broadly impact the narrative of Torah. They don't broadly impact, in Genesis, the patriarchs' lives. In the rest of the Torah, they don't broadly impact Moses and the Israelites' lives, but they're still there for a purpose. A prime example that I would give is Zelophahad's daughters. Right? Zelophahad's daughters appear in the book of Numbers. They first appear in Numbers chapter 27, and they are protesting because their father has died without any male heirs, without any sons. And they are worried as Moses is beginning to apportion what will be the tribal holdings for the people when they get to Canaan, that their father's name is going to be wiped out and that they won't have the right to inherit land. And so it's the first sort of feminist statement of, gee, how do we consider a situation like this, so on and so forth. But they actually reappear in, I believe it's chapter 31 of Numbers, when the elders of Manasseh, the tribe that they come from, says, hey, we understand that you've worked out a solution, Moses, but it doesn't quite sit well with me, and we have to renegotiate it again. But overall, there's not a lot of outside impact that the daughters of Zelophahad have on the overall Tanakh, other than this one particular episode. So RDY, when you made earlier reference to Noach, I would say that that's sort of similar to what I'm thinking of, because it's Noach's very special episode within his broader narrative. But to me, sort of equally interesting, and perhaps even more interesting, is when you have something like Zelophahad's daughters, where you don't know these characters from Adam, pardon the slight pun, until they actually come into the Torah. They do their little thing, but their broader impact on the overall action and the overall narrative is debatable.
I love that.
Yeah, this is awesome. I almost even brought up the daughters of Zelophahad 2 episodes ago when we were talking about assigning superheroes to biblical characters, but I struggled to find a good 5 women of the Justice League who I could assign to Zelophahad's daughters. I think that another thing that makes the daughters of Zelophahad a stronger comparison is that they have become this signal of feminism, like you mentioned briefly, above and beyond just having female characters, because they did change the impact of women's lives in that society, much in the same way that a very special episode, going back to the Different Strokes episode, impacted people who watched it and people who were able to discover tools to help themselves.
Absolutely. And, if a child who had been, inappropriately touched, for instance, watched that Different Strokes episode and got help, maybe it's the same as a female identifying B mitzvah student who has this section of Numbers as their parsha. I think this is Pinchas, if I'm not mistaken. And they say, wait a second, these women stood up for themselves? I thought the Torah didn't talk about women standing up for themselves. And, how impactful that can be. I know we're trying to remain family friendly here, so I'm not going to go into detail on these stories. For Jason and for Susan, you're welcome to look them up on your own. But, I would say it's similar for the appearance of Dinah in chapter 34 of Genesis, coming and teaching us something about the proper way and improper way to treat a woman. But then, she pretty much disappears from the narrative. But, there's potential that a person could read that and feel empowered to tell their own story of improper liberties being taken with them.
There's a big list, and I'm just trying to think of the different one-off characters that pop up and then don't pop up again to show up for those very special stories, whether they be these difficult topics or otherwise. The one that keeps popping into my head is Jethro, because I don't believe he pops up again. And it's not this heavy-handed story, but it is this lesson that Moses has to learn, right? And you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if Jethro shows up again outside of the Yitro.
Well,
I don't know.
Rabbi, you want to take it?
No, please, Rabbi, go ahead.
No,
No, Rabbi, go ahead. Rabbi, please. Rabbi.
So there's actually a debate about whether Jethro shows up again, because there are 3 male relatives named of Moses: Jethro, Reuel, and Hobab. And each of them sort of get this honorific attached to them that suggests that they are an in-law of Moses in some ways. And Rashi and other commentators and Midrash sort of play around with, okay, is this the same character recurring? Or are these different members of Moses' family coming at them in different ways? And there are Drashic etymologies. Hobab is derived from sort of the same root as the Arabic Habibi, my dear friend. Reuel is also derived from Rea, meaning friend. So are these nicknames for Jethro, or are these different figures in Moses' life? But more broadly, Barak, I would say that you're right, that he sort of, appears almost as a deus ex machina when Moses needs him, and then sort of fades from view.
I love thinking that Moses, after Jethro's advice, gets so relaxed and laid back about his situation that he's like, "Hey, oh Bob, how's it going?" Like every time Jethro shows up, he's got this great nickname for him because he just helped him out so much that he's such this figure in his life that he's just nicknamed him for the rest of the Bible. Is fantastic.
Yeah,
I think that could go really well or really awkward, like Meet the Parents awkward.
Right.
I think Jethro is a great example, a better example than the ones that I was thinking of. The one that I was thinking of was more of a Deus Ex Machina character where, one of those Ish characters who doesn't get described, who Joseph is wandering around looking for his brothers and some dude is wandering in a field and goes, "Oh, they went that way." Basically changes the course of Joseph's narrative. But one of the things that Jethro does that, again, affects us as a people is he teaches Moses how to pray. He's the one who gives us Baruch Atah Adonai. I think he just says Baruch Adonai. The idea of saying God is blessed for doing X, Y, Z, that comes from Jethro. And that's how we pray as Jews. So again, like having that long lasting effect, like the daughters of Zelophahad and like a very special episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of these folks may straddle the line between very special episode and sort of stunt casting. I think back again to different strokes. From one of my most memorable, growing up examples of stunt casting was when Arnold thought that he wanted to convert to Judaism and Milton Berle played the rabbi. And, I didn't know Milton Berle, from anyone, but it made me curious about who this was portraying a rabbi, particularly having been in a rabbinic family myself. But so we do have, one-offs like Shimshon, Samson. We have this great example or this great lesson in Numbers in Naso about the Nazir and somebody who might want to take a vow of service to God. And then actually in Judges, this becomes the Haftarah for Naso. You have the actual lived example of Samson becoming a Nazirite and what the joys and what the pitfalls are of being a Nazirite. So you also have those sort of very special episodes where they say, okay, let us illustrate for you what this precept is going to mean in practicality.
I guess most Haftarot could be a very special episode.
Yeah, I mean, in that sort of regard, you have the Torah telling you, do it this way, don't do it that way. And then you have sometimes the poor fall guy, but you have the guy in the Haftarah saying, oh, yeah, this is what happens if you actually do it this way. Another example is in Bahar B'Chukotai, they talk about the redemption of land in the Jubilee year. And then you get to the Haftarah, and the prophet Jeremiah is actually buying a plot of land from his cousin to illustrate how the laws of the Jubilee year should work.
Are there any, based on what you had said about not, let me say Milton Berle. Is that the name you used? It's not
Yeah.
the name. Oh, it is.
Berle.
Okay.
Earl.
Berle. Okay. You had mentioned Milton Berle coming on, and it makes me wonder, were there any of these one-off characters in the Torah who are described as sort of like celebrity people in some way, right? Wasn't Jethro a high up status for his group, right? I could be wrong about that.
Mhm.
Are there other people who, when they show up this one-off, is given this really ornate description so that you know they are a celebrity, but they're only here for this really quick time?
Metushalach, the oldest character. He lives to like 997 or something like that.
I would also say Bilam. When Bilam is introduced, our eyes open up because of the whole funny comedic incident with the donkey, but there's clearly an understanding within the Torah that this is a known guy who is already famous as the soothsayer and diviner and, curse bestower, who is so famous and sought out by Balak.
Who today would play that character?
Jack Black.
And 10 years ago, it would have been Alan Rickman.
Yes.
One of the things that I like about you giving us Balaam in this, thinking about 80s sitcoms, is like when, say, Fonzie would make an appearance on a non-Happy Days show. I want to say like he might have even been on Different Strokes or something of that era. There would always be a long pause because the live studio audience was hooting and hollering. Woo!
Yeah.
Absolutely. Or, I don't know if any of you were ever fans of anthology series like Love Boat and Fantasy Island that used to trot out, these actors towards the end of their careers and put them into these, either on the Love Boat, these lovey-dovey stories, or on Fantasy Island, these science fiction-y kind of stories. This is becoming a very 80s episode. And Ethan,
Right.
I don't mean to be leaving you out of that. But these celebrities, like, okay, maybe you would have a Michael J. Fox who was at the height of his career, but you'd also have, I don't know, Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon, who were still famous from 60s movies, but hadn't really done anything recently. And I'm sure that their fan base was excited to see, okay, how is this going to play out? And isn't it exciting to see Frankie and Annette reunited on the Love Boat again and so forth?
We can also stick to the episode that you brought us of Different Strokes, because the Bicycle Man was played by Gordon Jump, who like the year before had finished WKRP in Cincinnati as Big Guy. I don't remember the character's name except for his nickname, but he's the guy who famously on WKRP said, "As God is my witness, I thought turkeys could fly."
Yeah, so I was right at that age when Different Strokes, came on, and this episode came on in 83. I was 12 years old. I don't think that I was WKRP's core audience. Maybe you were as a Cincinnatian, RDY. So I don't know that I recognize Gordon Jump from that. He has said in interviews that he particularly took that role to sort of experiment and, go from playing this happy-go-lucky guy, in a sitcom who's sort of a doofus, and, he was like the Michael Scott of his day, to play this very serious and dark role. And he was worried it would typecast him, but he also later in his career became the Maytag repairman. So clearly that didn't, work against him.
No, I think comedians make the best serious actors. So the fact that he made that swap is probably why it was so impactful, because making somebody laugh is the hardest job you have. And so if you can do that, you can have them find the other emotions.
Right. And as Alan mentioned, this episode of Different Strokes was in 1983 and WKRP was finished in 1982. So this is what people knew of Gordon Jump. He was Big Guy, and here he is being this friendly shop owner. Like, he drew us all in, and in a way that only he could.
I'm not sure that every special episode, I'm sure like this is a theme for the 80s, but the examples I'm thinking of being a 90s kid, like I think of Home Improvement, And the two special episodes that I can think of is one where they thought one of the kids might have cancer, which I don't think you need a special guest for. The other where I think one of the kids was it selling drugs or doing drugs? Did any of you remember that?
I think it was selling.
Yeah.
If I remember, I think he was like hiding it in different parts of the house. So part of me remembers that, and I think it was selling.
Might have to do a quick Google.
Listeners, let us know.
Already mentioned, like just about every series had one of the teenagers is doing drugs episode.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure.
What's nice about talking about the Torah right now is that this becomes that 5780s episode.
Oh my God! I can say I am in the 80s. I have lived in the 80s.
Yeah, you're in 80s kid.
Congratulations.
You're 50.
Oh. Thank God.
Oh my God, Barack. Beautiful.
Alan, who are some other one-off characters that you had listed from the Torah?
I mean, so one of the other ones that I thought of, and again, these straddled more of the line of, are they very special episodes or are they stunt casting or a little bit of both? But there's the story of Yiftach and his daughter in the book of Judges. So Yiftach is not the most famous of the judges. If you ask somebody to name a character from the book of Judges, if they even know, they're probably going to name either Deborah or Samson. But Yiftach has this episode where he goes out into a battle and he says, hey, God, I'm not feeling so sure about this. I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. When I come back from battle, if I have won, and if you let me come back in safety, I will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of my house. Well, long story short, his daughter runs out to greet dad coming home from war, and he decides that he has to live up to his bargain. And, Ethan, talking before about how lessons with youth can change. So before I became a rabbi, I taught it in Jewish day school for 2 years. And this was part of the Tanakh lessons that I had to teach. And all of the students were looking for loopholes for Yiftach. Surely a fly or a wasp or something, flew into his face before his daughter got to him. Wasn't there some way that he could undo that? And undid my lessons for a week while we unpacked all of the midrash that they wanted to write to keep him from sacrificing his daughter. But at any rate, you have Yiftach here. He supposedly, in memory of his daughter, there's a great festival that is created where young unmarried girls go out and they dance and mourn for Yiftach's daughter to this very day, according to the Tanakh. I've never heard of this festival. So
you weren't invited.
Yeah, well, obviously, I wasn't the right gender and so forth. But more broadly speaking, I would say that perhaps this fits our category. I mean, we're defining the category, so I guess we can draw it however we want. But perhaps this fits the category of the very special episode because here is somebody that the Tanakh seems to think is going to have lasting prominence, and the story doesn't have quite the legs that the book of Judges seems to think it's going to have.
Plus, that story is a total ripoff of Agamemnon.
True.
And for Jason and Susan and my podcast co-hosts, Agamemnon is a Greek tragedy where King Agamemnon has to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia.
But in terms of time frame and so forth, would that be anachronistic to say that they're really a ripoff of each other? Would they have known of each other?
I would assume that whichever one was written first was written by someone who is literary and likely well-read as well as a good writer.
Okay.
It could be like a ants and bug life situation where like same time frame, there's somebody on the back end who moved places and so therefore the project's continued and da-da-da-da.
Sure. Or Kaddish and Lord's Prayer.
Sure.
They're the same. Look up the translation.
I have one more question and then I'll let you. Yes. Are there any special episodes of the Torah like Buffy's Hush or the Once More with Feeling, right? Are there any that are written
special musical episodes?
Well, yeah, like the ones that are specially written for you to take notice. Does that make sense?
I mean, scribally, we have the Song of the Sea is specifically laid out to say, hey, pay attention. This is the Song of the Sea.
The song, it's a musical episode.
Or the passage that some synagogues sing when they take out the Torah, Vayhi bin Aaron, Vayomer Moshe. This is set off by two inverted nuns in the text, that we have no other reason for, why these strange characters that are literally upside down nuns should appear. And why is this set apart? And, some say it's because it's a particularly old part of the Torah that is out of place here, or particularly a part of the Torah that the Masoretic scribes wanted us to pay attention for some reason. So scribally, certainly, I think that there are things that tradition wants us to pay attention to.
Yeah, those are two great answers for a musical episode.
Yeah. Could it also have been that someone spilled some ink and then just wanted to make a design on the other side that looked like it?
Yeah, certainly a possibility also. I mean, there are a fascinating subset of Torah called minuscules and majuscules, letters that are purposely, according to at least Ashkenazi Masoretic tradition, written smaller or larger. And the first time it may have just been totally a screw up by one poor little, scribe, but then because of the intensity of the Masoretic tradition, they get passed down from generation to generation to generation.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's, oh my gosh, we have to do it this way. But I can't think of any that have that same effect of, oh my gosh, I'm going to get to see Sarah Michelle Gellar sing, or.
But there are sections of the Torah where, when we're hearing them read, we behave differently. Like when we read Aser HaDibrot, the spoken Ten Commandments, we all
aren't there certain Torah tropes that are rarer than others that only happen?
Shalshelet is the common one. It's the commonly known rare one.
Yeah. So is that a special episode?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, the Shalshelet that I know appears, I want to say, RDY, you can correct me, but the instance that I know of appears, I think, when Jacob meets Rachel and kisses her. And so it sort of heightens the love story of that relationship. I don't remember where the other Shalshelets in the Torah appear. But yes, the tropes sort of underscore and illustrate the significance of that narrative. So I guess you could say that they are lending to a very special episode in that manner.
There's one in Lot's story, that one I know about.
Okay.
I think there are like 4, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, they're incredibly rare.
I was not expecting this much of an answer for that. That's great.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I wanted to pose is, when we think about some of these things that we've identified as very special episodes, particularly the ones that occur to the non-mainstream characters, that aren't the patriarchs and matriarchs, that aren't Moses and Aaron, etc., do they stand out for us, and do they resonate more because they are these very special guest stars and these one-off characters? Would the feminist inroads that Zelophahad's daughters forge be the same as if, Leah and Rachel had said to Laban, hey, you're screwing over our husband and we want to inherit some of your sheep and some of your land? If they played out within the normal context of the narrative, would we still pay as much attention to the episodes and the themes that they are highlighting?
That's a really good point. Good question that I'm reading as a point that, part of the reason you have to hire someone to play Mr. Bicycle Man is because if Mr. Drummond were to commit these heinous acts, he'd have to go to jail and be fired from the show. But I think it does also do something to our memory to have someone different being there front and center when we're used to a particular cast of characters. If Moses and Miriam and Aaron are doing something again, okay, we may or may not remember. But when the daughters of Zelophahad come and who are these nobodies? And they make this amazing point that has stuck with us for thousands of years.
Yeah, I think the ones that we've mentioned, it did their job right? We talked about a lot of different one-off characters, and they do stick out because they're not Moses and Abraham and Noah and Miriam and the main characters that we have followed. But even to your point, RDY, if somebody needed to get written off for the show, sometimes they did it in a way that was so impactful that now the ending of their story is the really big piece, right? Moses doesn't make it into the land of Israel with everybody else, and that is a big story that we tell and talk about. It's so important because how could this main character not continue with the rest of the story? The story isn't finished, and he's not going. There's a lot of
when Dr. Drake Ramore falls down the elevator shaft.
What is that from?
Friends.
Oh, I just.
Joey Tribbiani's character is Dr. Drake Ramore.
Oh. Yeah, so I think it does its job right. The ones that did well, and the ones that we don't know about, it wasn't a great story.
Right.
think we need to retitle this episode the one where RDI makes a Friends reference.
Oh, that's so good.
It'd be so misleading.
So I've been trying to find the time to plug this. There's not really time to plug this. I'm just going to throw it in because, we're 15 minutes in and I haven't talked about Star Trek yet. But Star Trek, the latest season of Strange New Worlds, had a musical episode. This is the first time I've ever really done something like this in Star Trek. And it was phenomenal. It is easily now one of my absolute favorite episodes. And so I think, there's such a wide category of a very special episode, from the serious topic home improvement ones to like the musical episode of Buffy or the musical episode of Star Trek, where
the puppet episode of Angel.
Yeah.
Just that it's such a wide range. I guess wanting to acknowledge that it's not always a serious topic, but perhaps there's something interesting that these examples we just gave are slightly more on the modern end of the curve than the 80s or 90s things. So, but that's my 2 cents.
Absolutely. So Tyler Moss, in an article in The Atlantic about TV very special episodes, says something that I think is also germane to some of these very special episodes that we've identified in the Torah. The main characters beloved by viewers would inevitably avoid serious harm. The dangers posed by storylines were more threats than actual occurrences, and on the occasion that bad things did happen, they usually happened to ancillary characters whom audiences cared less about. This selective meeting of moral justice kept lessons from becoming too morbid, while still allowing episodes to serve as cautionary tales. And I think, the main one that we keep coming back to seems to be Zelophahad's daughters. And I think that that's true, that there's not skin in the game from this being Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, and any of the female characters, even Miriam. Miriam's not standing up and saying, hey, Moses and Aaron, you've gotten all the glory for 4 books. It's my turn now. That there's something to be said about them being, as Moss says, ancillary characters. And yes, they have less skin in the game, but it also helps it sort of drive the point in sort of a neat little package.
And tangential to that, though, is that, again, going back to the Different Strokes episode, didn't Todd Hughes, who played Willis, have some like PTSD doing this episode because he suffered abuse as a younger person?
Absolutely. And this is a topic for a separate time about how messed up, the 3 kids playing the kids on the show, unfortunately, were in their actual lives. And I don't know if anybody has seen the documentary yet about Dan Schneider's time at Nickelodeon.
On my list.
Not yet, but
yeah. But, all kinds of stuff coming out on what happened in real life that makes these sorts of parallels all the more difficult. Nancy Reagan came on Different Strokes also at the height of Just Say No and did a drug awareness episode at a time when Dana Plato was fighting her own addiction sort of things. And so you have this weird intersection in Hollywood of real life and morality plays that's a whole other layer to this.
I wonder if it's going to shift in today's world, because we still get some special episodes here and there with streaming services. But you had said something about how we have these ancillary characters that come into play. And the first thing that came to my mind for Ethan was the episode of the Book of Boba Fett, where we followed the Mandalorian, which way off track for the series. So it was different from the storyline, but definitely
the best episode of the show.
It was the best.
So I was just about to say, there's a big problem if the best episode of the show does not feature the character that the show is named for. I don't think that's a very special episode. I think it's an indictment of the Book of Boba Fett.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Was it Xander? There's an episode of Buffy where the entire episode just followed Xander as a background character of what's going on when everybody else is doing the fighting the bad guy and yada yada. So I
mean, I don't know if any of you all have Stranger Things in your fandom. When they did that episode that followed
of 11
sister, and it was universally panned by everybody as the most awful episode, because for this appointment TV that you want to devour every single episode to not advance the plot at all, that was so dismaying also. And maybe there's a parallel there to Torah also. As RDY said, we're about to have an interruption of this monumental action in Shmini where Aaron's sons were just killed, and he remained silent. And now we have Tazria and Miss Torah and all this gross stuff that we got to slog through for 2 weeks before we get to, okay, well, what's going to be the aftermath of this? 2 of the major priests of our people have just been killed, and we're on this cliffhanger kind of thing.
Oh, that's fun. And pretty much universally panned, just like the 11 episode or the Mandalorian episode.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Panned
that's great.
because they were offering strange fire in their pans.
Mm-hmm. It was a good try. That'll make it in, though. Don't worry.
Well, this is why Alan is going to do the end of episode pod.
Well, Alan, this was a lot of fun. Do you have any shout outs or plugs that you'd like to put out into the Torah Smash verse in perpetuity?
Well, I hope that everybody will make an effort to save the Hill Valley Clock Tower. But I would say, I'm very proud of.
Can we explain why you said that because of Barack's background? Did you say that because of Barack's background?
Oh, I can't see it.
Oh my gosh.
I've got the hoverboard.
Oh, you have Out of Time up there?
Yeah, and the hoverboard, yeah.
Out of Time was a gift from his 2 very best friends.
Awesome.
He's talking about them. Yeah. All right, continue.
Sorry.
So I am very proud to be a rabbi of a small Midwestern congregation. If you're ever in Champaign-Urbana, please look us up at Sinai Temple. But please support, when you can, smaller Jewish communities throughout the Midwest and throughout the South, and support Jewish camping and Jewish youth that will create the future for those communities and our communities worldwide.
Yay.
Very nice. This was awesome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Honored to be here.
The only thing that I don't appreciate about you being here is that you're threatening my position.
While we're here, can I give a shout out for our next very special episode? So if you're listening to this, within the next 2 weeks, you will have our 2-year anniversary Dungeons & Dragons one-shot, which, similar to the things we've talked about, not the same format. So they hopefully stick out in your mind a little bit. So join us if you want to listen to us adventure through some Jewish fun times.
Jewish fun times.
Yeah.
What you talking about, Willis?
I was waiting for that.
I don't know if I can get away with that as a white man.
Yeah, I don't know if I was gonna keep it. It's okay.
Maybe we should talk about Tirza. It doesn't have the ring.
Now I want to keep it. Okay.
Spoiler alert: Tirza is one of the daughters of Zelophahad.
Oh, that's good stuff.
And if I could just say one more compliment that I didn't get to pay at the beginning. So, I know RDY. I don't know the other 2 of you as well. But during COVID, when Nifty was doing its distance, online things, maybe both of you, but I know at least Ethan was frequently my lifesaver when I was, pulling my hair out and you were running tech for all those different activities. So thank you.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Ethan and I co-led an event, and there were some adults on that one. And we did, was it a Star Wars Passover?
It was something about Passover, but you're right. Like I did, just because I knew Louis Dobin, I got drafted into helping a lot on the Campfire on Tour series, as well as just, random things back when Barack and I were regional directors.
Awesome.
But I did not help with those tech pieces. So that Ethan saved your life. I did not.
Yeah. Happy to be there.
But no, I mean, we're all in the Jewish world. I know we have lots of mutual friends and so forth. So it's nice to get to hang out with both of you. And
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this was
nice
I
to
love
meet
this.
you.
This was a very fun exploration. I really enjoyed this.
yes.
That'll do it for this episode of Torah Smash. Our fiscal sponsor is Jewish Creativity International. Our theme music was created by Sean Fogel. You can check out Sean's bands and studio work at www.thesleepywest.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to rate and review us wherever you listen. It helps others find us and is an excellent way to support the podcast. We want to hear from you and continue today's nerdy discussion. Go to TorahSmash.com to find where to connect with us online, purchase swag from our store, support us with a donation, find previous episodes, and more. And as nerdy podcasters, we know that words matter. Unless you multiply your words by the speed of light squared. Then we know that words energy.
Now the pressure's
Megan-
on this episode. I'm just like,
Join us for the next 2 episodes for a very special podcast.